you've done.
Well, that's what I did. Fire that. Good job.
Yeah.
I have to imagine back.
Yeah. Definitely.
It sounds like it's pretty much for them when they're saying it's just because, getting along fairly well. It's kind of like a good way.
Right.
Not having your own place. So when it's done, have you been home?
I saw a video. Yeah, he just went through the camera. It looks great. The lighting is awesome.
It's excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's such a rebuild place.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I thought that put in a bit of the flooring. The flooring was turning out awesome.
Yeah.
Pretty good stuff. But
I hope. Well, they'll be in there long. They'll definitely get their money out of it.
oh yeah, I think the place is okay before now. At the end, during the energy program, so we'll get back. Probably not as much.
Yeah.
Depends on how much everything went out. But I think.
I think it was way down.
Yeah, it's been out.
I was talking with somebody who did that and got their money. It actually worked. Jennifer. Well, she has.
I think what they said is. Five thousand people said still very little.
Wow.
But they're expecting to get a big burst or something.
Sure.
Midsummer.
Yeah. Yeah, Jennifer's having work done. Just started, so I was working on the crawl space. Just didn't have time to finish the impact. So I'm curious just what it looks like. Yeah. There was I went in and put blocks between all the toilets, 2-inch, and then yeah, and then the crawl space is actually, you can stand like this, so there's like 4 inches. And that was insulated, but they insulated the top. Yeah, just with like stapled to the sill. Anyway, I hate the crawl. It wasn't even that. It was all that. I was.
But that gets a bit warm. Second word is guys I walked by the other day.
Probably forgot.
Yeah, Paul Nobody wants to go. You were going to say somebody. If nobody wants to go, you could ask should I give it. I'll do. Oh yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, 'cause I didn't remember we knew that. Yeah, they were nice trees. They were nice birch bugs. They're the only birds I've seen that look like they have branches. They need to have branches so that they get some paper because the branches are feeding that part of the tree. Oh yeah. Oh, they almost look like European, but yeah. But they weren't. I just. They don't look like things that came out of the middle of the woods. They look like things that were grown in the open. So yeah, yeah. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if some of them make it, what they look like when they get bigger, but. Crazy about what he did. Because the middle, the leader's still dead. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Am I in the wrong? I think. Sorry about that.
I was thinking today, we give grants, and I was thinking as I was leaving work today, we should give a grant for somebody to do a news protection demo. And go somewhere where there's a whole bunch of trees and spray some, try different fencing, get something that looks nice and do some sort of a visual preference test on it. And just try like 10 different things and leave it for 3 years and see.
Oh, that's good. That's good. How about with you? Good.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm happy to see big things go in, just so they're nice big things, but I know they cost more. Yeah, and they seem to be fine. Oh, they did?
For the smaller ones, they're that tall.
And they damaged those two? Oh. And Martin got us some that, to have the community project we did last summer that he dug, and they were nice, they were big, and they had some fungus root balls, and they weren't like what they'd seen in the past. I mean, he knew he was bringing them for me and Tomash, but... Yeah. So this is Tomash expect him, and he knew I was there, so because we were thinking we were going to get hard to move him around. No, but I don't think you really need a tree spade. I don't think it's shaped. Yeah, it is a lot of work.
Okay, that's what I was wondering, but there's some sort of supply of
What's the code? Is it like your last?
I have to do it every time it's I know, and then I always go through, like, is it home or is it work every week? I should write it down.
This case on the consent agenda, and I'm the one that someone pull it. I'll talk to someone. There's a couple of conditions I want to add.
I think I can remember my own phone number. I bet I got it on my cell phone. We have a work session?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what's your sense of things?
I did. For home, county, and my The other.
So was there any discussion about moving the garages further back?
And I think
Yeah, I might have a few notions. I'll share. I'll just share with the group, and so. So these, I guess, these are the sort of other. Are there other things that apply here?
all the gray stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're a developer and you're wanting to come in and build do a subdivision, so you'd pull up this one, and this is the only thing that you'd have to be concerned about, in terms of the
That's actually
residential building?
I think you have to look at landscape stuff also. I think there's different sections of Title 21, but I think you're probably correct. They're looking at single family. And the couple of comments left, they'd like to actually apply. Oddly, not oddly, photos. They talk about the tree ways having funny photos. They have an awning actually, onto the path. Like there's a path sign. I guess solve every problem.
So, and I'm just wondering how it relates to other, aspects, such as those code that speak to solar orientation.
Yeah.
Especially when you're looking at the townhouse residential, where you have much more, where you have higher density, and it'd be possible to, build a row of houses that's, if you orient it wrong, you're in sun, you're in shadow.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know about you, but you'd want, I would think you'd want to kind of maximize the number of units that that have exposure that face south or have good,
Or having
western.
spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be okay if bedrooms are facing northeast, and
Right.
there's no problem with that. But one would think that you'd want to kind of, be looking at trying to get your housing stock to recognize its relationship to the climate and to the especially the sun and the living space. As you say, the living space is really kind of the most important piece. So yeah, well, just
No, it's a
good notion.
It's a good thought. But,
Oh, so so you think that there's a significant number of our residents who enjoy it in the garden? Of course.
Depending on the price, yeah.
You're in the Northeast, baby. I don't want no sticking sand. Respecting, but I appreciate the effort.
I'm not drinking
I don't know too many.
I'd like to call to order our Urban Design Commission meeting for Wednesday, February 11th. Let's begin with roll call.
Present.
Here.
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 Here?
Here.
Here. There was minutes from the Wednesday, January 28th meeting included in the packet. We have a motion to approve. Is this working? Did I not do something right? Hang on a second, I got some technical difficulties. Voting not in progress? What?
It's not.
Do I need to be... Oh, here we go. Yeah. All right, we have a motion and a second. Any objection to passing the minutes? Seeing none, they'll stand as written. Next is disclosures. Any commissioners have anything they wish to disclose this evening? All right, I don't see any disclosures, so we're moving on to the consent agenda. Does anybody wish to pull the case that's on the consent agenda?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would like to pull case 2008-114 from the consent agenda.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I had a couple of conditions that I wanted to add to the list here. Number 3 reads, provide detail of raised crosswalk for traffic department approval. I spoke with traffic department, and they have a standard detail that they use for raised crosswalks. It's a crosswalk design that's been used and already constructed in several locations around town, and it's one that they know that works, and it also works with snow plowing. So they wanted to make sure that this raised crosswalk, met that design. And number 4, if you turn to page L2.0, it's the detail sheet. It's the detail for the decorative fence along the bottom of the page. I looked at it and thought, this fence is located right in front of the school. If you look on the previous sheet, L1.2, it's the fence that separates that front schoolyard from the driveway. It's meant to, if kids are playing in the front area, it prevents the children from running out into the driveway or chasing bouncing balls, et cetera. I put a condition here that reads, add wood trim to bottom of decorative fence, rear view of fence shall match front view. The rear view is the side of the fence that would be facing the school, so everyone leaving the school, this would be their view of the fence. It's pretty much just a chain link. And so I thought the wood trim should also be added to that side of the fence also. That's all I have.
A question has come up in my mind on this case that's sort of procedural. Many times the department will recommend approval, and in this case we have a condition that's sort of partially met with regard to the 15-foot buffer that we've talked a couple of meetings before. I think this came up when we were talking about Chester Valley, about a school renovation where they're inheriting some pre-existing conditions from an older installation that raise the question about how much compliance you're forced to come into for any new project. And at that time, you had instructed us that we had to be 100% compliant when we invested in a new school renovation. And I was just wondering if you could clarify that.
Yes, since that time, we've had a discussion in the department about that, and the way we are going to proceed is if there is a site change or a building change on that side of the property, then that side of the property will have to be brought up to code. But if they're not making changes, say, on the rear of the property, then the rear of the property can stay as it is.
So in this particular case, where we're putting in a new traffic circulation, aisles and whatnot,
Driveways and, yeah.
I guess the thing that was confusing for me was that part of this relates to an intersection improvement, and there's an alignment that the petitioner has talked about that was predetermined by the location of the traffic intersection. And that, in some way or another, is driving everything with regard to the condition or extent of that 15-foot buffer. Has there been any discussion at the department about that?
In this particular case, we recognize that, as you said, that the driveway had to line up with the street across Jewel Lake Road. And so there isn't any opportunity to move the driveway a bit further to the north to allow that 15-foot landscape buffer. So in this case, there really isn't any alternative that we could see. I met with the design consultants other than to put up that double-sided fence in that location to try and mitigate for the fact that there isn't room to put up that 15 feet for the 15-foot landscape buffer.
But I guess I keep coming back to this idea that if traffic decides to put this in, yet there's this zoning requirement to have the buffer, I mean, under what circumstances would you take additional property from the adjacent landholder or something like that to make the intersection work? I mean, these guys have inherited something that doesn't seem to be a school district kind of issue.
In this case, because of the need to line up the driveway with the street across, that would take priority over this landscape buffer in this instance. And with that space, what's left, we'd try to mitigate as well as we can, recognizing that there is no room to put the 15-foot landscape buffer because it is a pre-existing situation.
So we're on solid legal ground. We don't have to recommend a variance or anything like that.
We also had this discussion. If it went to ZEBA, it likely would end up with the same result, and it would push the project back probably 3 months while they went through that process, and the result would likely be the same.
Okay. Do any of the commissioners have questions on the project?
I have one quick question on the fence. Number 4 that you added, Sharon, you saying we want to include wood trim on both sides of the fence, which makes sense, but also a bottom.
Yes, to add put a bottom wood trim also to the bottom of the fence.
I'm trying to, on this detail, the wood is intended to clad the galvanized posts. And I'm trying to remember my details, but I'm not sure it's typical for a chain link fence to have a bottom rail, so I don't want to really stipulate. Have you seen a detail like that has a wood rail on the bottom?
Yes, we've seen other fences similar to this, and it would look very much like the piece that's along the top. They may have to add yet another wooden piece on it to attach to, but it should work. We've seen other details like this where it's a combination wood fence with a chain link.
And it does have a bottom.
Yes, it did have the bottom trim piece on it.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody have any questions of the petitioner? So, someone have a motion? Mr. Briggs has moved. It's been, oh wait, can't second. We need to hear the motion.
Move to approve UDC case number 2008-114 as meeting UDC requirements for final landscape plan review with staff recommendations 1 and 2 is written in our package, and the addition of a third condition requesting the provision of a detail for the raised crosswalk that coordinates with other similar raised crosswalks in Anchorage. And 4, add wood trim to the bottom of fence and have both sides with the same trim design. So it's the fence looks the same when you look at it both ways.
And that's been seconded. Any discussion?
I guess my only discussion would just be that it is good to see that we do have, for the renovation projects, a little bit better guidelines for flexibility, since that has come up a few times in the past, and especially for a project like this where there is the road or an existing building that does limit the petitioner's ability to provide the 15-foot landscaping as required. So it provides us good clarification and ability to move forwards on these in more of a spirit of cooperation with the ASD, I think. So thank you for the clarification.
Anyone else wants to speak on the motion? No further discussion. It's time for a vote. Any objection to passing the motion? Seeing and hearing none, motion passes. Next on the agenda is under the unfinished business category. It's case 2007-153 for the Title 21, Chapter 7, governing the single-family, two-family, and townhouse building design standards. Do we have a presentation from staff on that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We have several items to pass out tonight that you'll be able to refer to while deliberating on the draft single-family, two-family, and townhouse design standards as part of the Title 21 rewrite. While those are being handed out, and before the deliberations begin, we would like the opportunity to present on 3 basic points about the materials that you're going through tonight. The first one is project context, what you're being asked to do in context of where we are in the Title 21 rewrite. The second one, a part of that context, is some of the community objectives that the standards are intended to implement, just to give you that overall context. The second point I'd like to cover tonight is the regulatory approach, why the standards appear like they do in menus, and why the type of language being used is being used. And then thirdly and lastly, to give you an overview of the recommended changes that you recently received. That last several weeks we went through a work session with the Planning and Zoning Commission and several members of the Urban Design Commission that were able to appear regarding the track changes version that you've recently received. Basically, what is being asked of the UDC in terms of the context is basically formal or formal comments to the Assembly and Planning and Zoning Commission, and or informal comments to staff that we can use going forward on the single-family, two-family, and townhouse standards. These are subsections 21, 07, 100, E, and F. The other subsections of the residential design standards in section 21, 07, 100, the residential design standards, these include the overall purpose statement for the residential standards, other generally applicable items such as standards for driveway width, standards for multifamily development. These are not a part of what we're intended to cover tonight, and they will be submitted to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Urban Design Commission in the coming weeks. So what we're really focusing on tonight is just the building design standards for single-family, two-family, and townhouse that we provided to you. The type of advice that we're looking for is similar to what the UDC provided for the landscaping section. Basically, it was good policy-level advice, and it didn't necessarily delve down into wordsmithing or specific changes. Those suggestions are welcome. What we also really appreciate that overall policy-level guidance that the Commission can provide. And so the type of comments, the type of suggestions, that level that was provided for landscaping are very appreciated. That's not to say that specific comments about specific language used, such as if you were to find something to the effect of development is required to have an appropriate scale compatible with neighboring development, that kind of, if there are problems with language, just please frame it in the overall context of what's wrong with it, the type of specificity or problem needed to be solved without trying to actually solve the language level problem. Time is relatively limited on the project, so we would appreciate getting as far as possible tonight and in terms of deliberations on these two sections. The second of the 3 points we'd like to talk about are community objectives and directives. Basically, where these stand now, we believe are basically, they will improve on the level of development design quality today. They'll result in better development. But they're basically at the level of what we believe to be the most practical and affordable level of changes and requirements. And they reflect a lot of testing over the last 4 or 5 years and a lot of discussion with the community. And in fact, there is a community expectation that we are going to provide design standards that make a difference in the design of buildings, that implement as much as possible practical the policies of Anchorage 2020. And that was the original purpose for including the building design standards in the Title 21 rewrite. So the public expectation comes from the comprehensive plan. It also comes from a lot of the work that the public put in over the last 6 to 7 years in the Title 21 rewrite, as well as the amount of time that was put into Anchorage 2020. The policies that I'd like to mention tonight, there are 5, but there are others that refer to design. Anchorage 2020, as some of you may know, has 100 policies. And they range from all kinds of things, from level of service to land use, transportation. But there are some policies that reflect, focus on future residential development and design. Policy 46 states that the unique appeal of individual residential neighborhoods shall be protected and enhanced in accordance with applicable goals, policies, and strategies. Each policy has what are called essential implementation strategies, and an essential implementation strategy for Policy 6, protecting neighborhoods, is something called design standards, and that is intended to be implemented in no small part through the zoning ordinance changes. Policy 49 is in addition, is a policy regarding compatibility. It's site plan layout and building design for new development shall consider the character of adjacent development. The municipality may require layouts and design to incorporate the functional and aesthetic character of adjacent development. And that's also implemented through design standards. Policy 52, site and design residential development to enhance the residential streetscape and diminish the prominence of garages and paved parking areas. Again, that is implemented through several strategies. One considered essential strategies is design standards. And again, that is to be implemented in no small part through the ordinance changes and the zoning requirements. There are just a few more policies. One is Policy 99, incorporate crime prevention and other public safety needs into the design of residential and commercial areas, individual buildings. Use design standards to improve natural surveillance. This is basically informal surveillance, eyes on the street, basically that type of environment. To improve natural surveillance, residents' sense of ownership and control of the neighborhood, and overall public safety through appropriate environmental design. And this basically has to do with ensuring that the living spaces of the residents, the windows, do have visual access between the street, pedestrian environment, the residential dwellings. It's also things such as making primary entrances prominent or at least visible, easily accessible. Police departments around the country, as well as the experts in public safety, have recognized that this actually makes a big difference. And it has public safety aspect and also has the aspect of making the neighborhood environment just more pleasant, more walkable. And so these are the types of strategies, policies that Anchorage 2020 is recommending. There's also an affordable housing policy, and there are two. One is to encourage more affordable housing, and the other is to design attractive affordable housing suited to its environs. And with the increasing price of housing and the current economic conditions, one concern is, are we increasing the cost of housing? Well, these Anchorage 2020 policies have an essential strategy called affordable housing. And the objective of the affordable housing strategy in Anchorage 2020 is to remove regulatory impediments that increase housing costs without a clear and convincing public benefit. However, it is not designed to result in the addition of structures that are insensitive to community design expectations or are of reduced quality or shorter building life. In other words, we're not sacrificing the future of the neighborhood or future neighborhood values in order to decrease initial costs, especially where there is a clear community objective, for example, eyes on the street, or other policy in Anchorage 2020 that's at stake. So there's a balance. These types of objectives have to do with the relationship of the building to the public street, the relationship to the public realm. So what you'll find here are standards. They're called design standards, but really they're really how the building behaves relative to the street, is it's oriented to the street. And also how the building behaves relative to its neighbors. There's a lot about neighborhood compatibility, compatible scale, compatible design. And that has to do with perhaps where you have a mixed density neighborhood, like an R2M neighborhood, that the multifamily, for example, or townhouse isn't developed at such a scale that it may be of an incompatible scale with the neighboring residential. These are standards about, not about design or style. These aren't design standards in terms of trying to to be prescriptive about determining a certain design outcome, and they aren't intended to restrict the creative process in design or designers. There's a purpose statement at the beginning of section 2107-100. It's a subsection A. It's a purpose statement for the whole section, and it lays out basically the overall intent of the section. And then once you get to each section, subsection E, single family, two family, subsection F, townhouse, subsection G, multifamily, each of those has a purpose statement. And those purpose statements are intended to elaborate and pull out objectives specific to that housing type. So those are some of the community objectives. There was a lot of time put in throughout the process by different groups in the community. And these standards are intended to reflect the general guidance of those processes. And that could be testing conducted with the Mayor's Real Estate Task Force in 2004, 2005, work by the Boards and Commissions Advisory Committee back in 2003, 2004, and then public comments we received throughout the process. In addition to the giving you the overall context of the objectives, I want to briefly touch on the regulatory approach. Basically, where these standards attempt to walk a line between being flexible and being clear. So much of the discretionary language that appeared in earlier drafts that was vague or perhaps difficult or left it up to interpretation has been replaced by very specific language, and the idea of creating less discretion at the front counter and less negotiation. The way we build flexibility into such language is that there are just basically more options, basically through a menu approach. You'll find that the standards have menus, basically instead of a prescriptive directive, that a standard is implemented through anywhere from 5 to 10 menu choices. Basically, what we think the menus will do, they will make the developer or the designer consider or respond to the issue without determining what that design response will be. And that's a key approach. And it's made the Anchorage draft standards longer than some of the standards we've seen in other cities. Other cities just tell you what's going to happen in about half a page, and any variance from that is variance process. But our menus do make our standards longer, but because the language is specific, we believe that it'll be not discretionary, but simply a matter of picking from specific choices. Alternative means and methods, basically allowing for innovation. The Title 21 rewrite includes in another section, not in the residential design standards, something called alternative equivalent compliance. And we wanted you to make sure that, to remind you that that's there. And it's basically for the recommended building design standards for residential, commercial, public institutional, large retail establishments, that there's this process by which the applicant can propose a different solution from what is available in the menus that meets the intent of the ordinance in a way that's at least as effective as the standards. And that process is available to allow for innovation. Besides alternative equivalent compliance, there are other changes in the Title 21 rewrite that, from the current code that we believe will increase flexibility. The parking requirement is falling by anywhere from 15 to 20, or in some cases 50%. This is a substantial change, and we believe it'll substantially reduce the land area requirement of some sites. We have taken a look at the potential effect of this on specific sites, some of which are in the photographs that you have. And these changes in the parking requirement are based on pretty sound data. Some of it's unexpected and surprising, but basically the long and short of it is that our parking demand is much lower than the current code requires in many areas of town. So, for example, if you are near downtown, your parking requirement may be reduced by 25% from the Title 21 rewrite, which itself is reduced anywhere from 15 to 20% from the current code. So there are some substantial parking reductions. Now, balancing with that are increases in landscaping requirements that are proposed, a requirement that the developer identify the area on the site where snow storage is to take place, and standards for providing pedestrian connections. These are going to have the effect of increasing land area requirements. We conducted an extensive process called an economic impact analysis to try to see what the balance is. Is the full sum of all these requirements costing more land or money, or are these site requirements reducing? And we found for residential, in no small part because of the parking reductions, that the full impact of the site standards are, in general, a reduced land area requirement and the ability to more efficiently use land under the Title 21 rewrite. And that's important because we want to make sure that folks understand out there that at least for residential, the Title 21 rewrite isn't intended to, quote-unquote, pile it on. Our open space requirement isn't increasing in area from current code, but the quality, there's some minimum standards for the quality and then the minimum dimensions for common open space, private open space requirements. So the current code uses a usable yard language. The proposed code will use private open space. So these are some other sections. Lastly, I just want to touch on a third element, which is just to give you an overview of the changes and amendments. And I'm not going to go into any great detail, but I just want to give you a sense of why there's so much yellow and gray in your draft. Basically, the changes in general are recommended in context of our overall approach. We want more clarity and specificity, and we want to increase flexibility. And some of the changes reflect comments from a few builders that they had trouble interpreting them. Some of the changes result from testing that we conducted on some of the developments that you see there in the photographs. And we found that some of the draft standards in the public hearing draft were actually subject to such interpretation that you'd have three different opinions about what it meant around the room. We wanted to make sure that that didn't create problems at the front counter. Some of the changes are increases in the number of menu choices. And the more menu choices there are, the less likely the same over and over design solution is going to be the only one available to designers. There are some changes in terms of added language, added standards. For example, in the townhouse section, there are building spacing requirements. Well, they suddenly appeared. Well, the building spacing requirements, a minimum of 40 feet between buildings in multifamily, have been around for many drafts. In past discussions with the Title 21 subcommittee of the local AIA chapter, they believed that those were appropriate, building spacing standards were appropriate, and that they understood the general push to make sure that multifamily buildings are oriented to the street, windows or frontage, engaging the streetscape. Well, that language, that type of stuff was never in the townhouse section. It was a very short section. So during our testing of the multifamily section, we found that some of those buildings that we thought were going to be falling under the multifamily standards are actually fourplexes, but because of their internal layout, would be counted as townhouses. They had the same bulk, the same spacing issues, the same building-to-street relationship problems as some multifamily buildings, but their neighbor, the fourplex, would have to comply with the standards, but they wouldn't because they're townhouses. So some of the changes are additional standards in the townhouse section, somewhat in the single-family section dealing with windows, building orientation, that are dealt with in multifamily, are dealt with in the purpose statement for this section, dealt with in Anchorage 2020, but there isn't a consistency in those subsections. So that's why you see standards added. You'll see some standards deleted. Reference to alley access requirements and things like that are deleted from the townhouse section. Again, that has to do with consistency. What we will bring forward to you in the remainder of the residential standards is a more consolidated, generally applicable section about when alley access will be required and what are the appropriate times when there can be an exception to that. And that would apply to several different housing types instead of putting that in just one section. Increased flexibility in some of the menus. Some of the menus have been completely changed, and you'll see that in the yellow. And Erica can help me here, but basically in the single-family section, you'll find a section about garages in which there were two menus, basically an A menu and a B menu. And basically, the long and short of it was there were about 4 options, 4 choices, and you were to pick one from one menu and 2 from another menu. Well, that's been replaced by a longer menu with 10 choices. And as part of that, the garages are being allowed to basically push out from the front of the house facade, whereas before they were not. And we can explain the reasons why that occurred. But essentially, there's more flexibility built in that approach. Likewise, in the townhouse section, instead of requiring front-facing garages to be recessed into the facade, we're giving 3 choices, basically. We're adding some flexibility. So it creates a lot of length, a lot of yellow in the track changes, a lot of gray. But in general, it's not intended to be as scary as it looks. And we think that it is consistent with and more appropriately implements the guidance we've received over the last 6 years. And that's my part of the presentation, but we just wanted to give you that context and basically encourage you to deliberate on these, get as far as possible. And the type of comments that the Commission provided on the landscaping, that policy level guidance, was very helpful, and we'd appreciate that again. Thanks.
So are you looking for questions at this time?
That'd be great. Fine.
Anybody have any questions, Tom?
It seems there's a lot of concern about garages, and obviously from the photo documentation I've seen, a number of these developments, it is a problem, not just here, everywhere. But what is the municipality's policy about alleys? I see a couple, it is addressed that, if these things are provided in the alley and so forth, but if you're trying to orient the front of the house to the street and really downplay the garage, might it be better to encourage alleys? And I guess having said that, then, in some communities, they, in their regulations, actually try and have gone away from alleys, as we know. The kind of the suburban type development model where there is no alley. And in some of the older parts of Anchorage, there are alleys. I don't know who plows the snow or anything like that, but I think they certainly could work here. Anchorage doesn't get all that much snow. That snow storage in the back would be a problem, or in a narrow type alley situation. So what is the municipality's position on alleys?
Through the chair, Commissioner Coleman, I'm not sure the municipality has an official position. They aren't platted much lately. I'm not actually aware of an alley, of a subdivision with alleys being platted in my 6 years here, and it's probably been significantly before that. We have tried to, we understand that they take up more land, in a subdivision, and they increase the cost of development because you have more paving, more site preparation for the roadbed, et cetera, et cetera. So one thing that we have done is said that if you do provide alleys, that you can put half the alley on each of the lots that are back-to-back so that you don't have to use extra land. So that takes away the land cost, but it doesn't help with the construction costs.
In other places, alleys are being encouraged, the new urbanist type developments and so forth. Is this a direction you think that the municipality might want to go? And perhaps there are ways that alley development costs can be reduced. Would you really need it to be paved? Could the front street be narrower, and so forth?
There's definitely been an interest in being able to narrow the front streets. We've discussed that through the Title 21 rewrite, but we didn't actually achieve that when we redid Chapter 8, the subdivision section, although I think there's interest in continuing that conversation after the code is adopted to maybe rework some of that section. One of the things to think about is that most of the large undeveloped areas left in the bowl, at least, are on the hillside, and that's slope development isn't always so conducive to having alleys. So it hasn't been something that we've leaned very heavily on, but
as land becomes, less available, perhaps you'll see people trying to redevelop other parts of the city, some of the old mobile home parks and so forth.
That's true.
May create ideal locations for new urbanist type development.
We'd certainly be open to ideas of other ways to incentivize the creation of alleys in subdivisions, or in site condos even.
So is there something we could do in here, to encourage that? I noted in your photographic reference catalog, I'll try and find it quickly here, which photograph, number 45 in the photographic reference catalog of townhouse development. This looks very much like, the style development that you're seeing a lot of in other places, perhaps even here in Anchorage. I'm not that familiar.
This is in Portland. Excuse me for interrupting.
This is
from
Portland?
Portland, Oregon, yes.
But again, the garage is in the front, kind of reducing that living space there. But yet it has, a narrow street and the building's quite close to the road.
We'd be open to your ideas. I don't know, depending on the idea, this may or may not be the appropriate section for it, but certainly if we were to generate a number of workable ideas, we would find the appropriate place for them to be, for the sections for them to be proposed in.
Are there separate standards then for a PUD, or is this part of that?
There are separate standards. A PUD is a type of conditional use, so they are in Chapter 3 under the conditional use section. Chapter 3 was just provisionally approved by the Assembly either last week or 2 weeks ago. So you can, I can provide you a copy, or you can download it off the website to see what's been provisionally adopted, and then, of course, if we need to make changes, there is time to do that.
Okay, thank you.
If I can add, one of the sections that we do intend to bring forward in the residential design standards is a section regarding alley access. So you'll find that we deleted that from our townhouse section, and with the intent that where there's an existing alley, that access in most cases be required and an alley subsection might be a place in the future to deal with the issue of actually encouraging alleys and new development. We're also looking at the driveway width section and talking with and that's subsection D. That's a section where we're going to be talking with the traffic engineer about ways to encourage combined access driveways that perhaps go to the rear of the building, maybe like a shared access driveway behind the building in a small infill development rather than garages in the front.
Other questions?
Yes, I do have one. Will you please clarify me if this standard are going to apply to new housing or also existing houses, people who want to renovate, add it to their houses? Will this thing apply to, or it's only for new houses?
Through the chair, Commissioner Ania, it will definitely apply to new houses. It will not apply to a situation where like a house is destroyed in a fire and they need to rebuild. We've actually pretty much exempted single and two-family homes from the non-conforming section, all with the exception of non-conforming lots. In terms of additions, I think this would apply.
In the area where I live, there are some houses which the garage is basically, I would say, over 65% of the facade. What will happen then? I mean, let's say the guys are changing, I don't know, say, adding something in the back, for example, or...
Oh, I'm sorry. What I meant was that you wouldn't be able to, say you met the standards, then I don't think you'd be able to renovate in a way that didn't meet the standards. If you don't meet the standards, but you're renovating, and we should probably clarify this, if you don't meet the standards and you're renovating, I don't think you would then have to renovate in a way to meet the standards.
Okay, well, let me rephrase it. Existing house. The front of the house now does not meet the standards, okay? But the person is adding maybe something in the back on the side of the house, at the back area. But the front of the house will not meet the standards. I guess that will be okay, huh?
Yes.
Okay. The other question I have is, you can clarify for me in the standard for townhouses, section 3B, who is going to be the decision-making body? That the planning department?
Through the chair, Commissioner Ania, the townhouse dwelling is intended to be permitted by right through an administrative site plan review. So in many cases, the reviewer will be the planning department. So decision-making body simply refers to whatever the review body for that particular development is. Whether it's a site plan review administered by staff or a major site plan review administered by the Urban Design Commission, that's the decision-making body. So it varies depending on the review. For example, this could be a townhouse development permitted by right, site plan review. Decision-making body would be the staff reviewer and the director. Let's say the development's a part of a larger development, and perhaps for one reason or another is going through a major site plan review. Well, then the decision-making body would be the commission.
Thank you.
Mr. Kaplan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I guess I'm a little confused. certainly, one of the, as I followed the effort to rewrite Title 21, there's been, a great deal of discussion regarding how the structure relates to the street, how a person, the sense of place that a person has when they walk down a street. And I remember the discussions about, snout, homes and, where the streetscape is dominated by the storage vehicle or the storage of a vehicle. And so I was thinking that, well, the citizens of Anchorage, what they wanted to see was that they wanted to see the relationship between a human being and the built environment and the automobile, the technology that we move for mobility, be changed, and that our physical structures be geared more towards the human scale, more towards the person rather than to the automobile. And yet when I look at the proposed recommendations that have come forward, while I do see some effort to soften the facade of those structures, I still see a heavy emphasis on the automobile and its storage, and the placement of the garage at the front, where you're allowing up to 65% of the total length of the building's elevation to be consumed by a storage space for automobiles. Out in front of a porch or a place where pedestrians or people would dwell seems to be kind of in contradiction to what we've been trying to move forward with, and that as a countervailing approach, it would have been to see the garage actually move back. If you can't move it back to the alley, if there's no alleys, then certainly move it back further towards the rear of the structure, so that it's not as an imposing presence to the pedestrian as they are walking along the street. And I find it kind of curious that in front of us tonight are copies of the pedestrian plan, and just happen to open it up and say, well, what does it say about pedestrians and the street and the quality of the environment? And so, so on page 5, plan goals, and goal 5, review the relationship of street design to the design of adjacent land uses, to consider needs of all users, and goal 1, create a safer, more walkable city that will encourage year-round pedestrian activity and make walking a safer and more attractive activity. So a safer and more attractive activity would seem, in my mind, to be one where if you're walking down the street in a residential subdivision or in a subdivision of townhomes, single-family or townhomes, it would be scaled to the pedestrian, rather than it being scaled to, the automobile. And so that you would not be, when you're walking down the streetscape, rather than seeing large vehicles, parked out in front, adjacent to in between the building and the sidewalk, they would be hidden from view, back either to the side of the building or back of the building. And so that the streetscape environment is really dominated by a yard or by trees or landscaping. And so I'm trying to kind of work my mind around why there appears to be that inconsistency between what I've heard in the past about wanting to create a more pedestrian-friendly environment and what I'm seeing presented, which is really where we've retreated from that and really accepted the dominance of the automobile, in the future of the residential space in this community. And maybe I'm just missing something. And I was wondering if you could help me understand, why, there's not more of a pedestrian orientation in these designs.
Through the chair, Commissioner Kemplin, I don't disagree with you at all. That said, through our work with various bodies, various groups, the public comments, it seems that we need to move in baby steps. And this is a baby step towards that goal. It is augmented by increased landscaping requirements, by sidewalk requirements on both sides of streets, of residential streets that, we don't have today. But you're not wrong.
Okay. Are there opportunities for the language to be shaped to give, if it, more of if you don't want to make it mandatory, if you want to provide flexibility, to provide at least language in there that gives more incentives for a developer to move the garage backward, to move the vehicle, the dominance of the vehicle away from the street realm.
We would be happy to carry forward a recommendation from this body that says that. I should tell you that when the Planning and Zoning Commission looked at this on Monday night, they watered down what's in here. So a recommendation that goes more towards the goals of our comprehensive plan, I think, would be welcomed.
Well, it does certainly seem as though we're at odds here with some of our planning documents. We're moving forward with some goals, like the pedestrian plan and some other plans where we're kind of looking at creating a pedestrian scaled environment. Yet when we're advancing Title 21, they're not necessarily they're not syncing up, with those planning, goals. And the inconsistency just seems to be a little jarring, to me. And well, I don't want to beat it to death. So, if I'm moving on to a different point, if I may, for the townhomes and how they relate to one another, has there been thought given to their use, the way that they're laid out, to create more of a civic space, a social space? And kind of like what comes to mind is, if you kind of look at, now I don't know if this figure, this photograph, it's 27B in your handout that you provided, and I don't know if that's an example of what you consider, bad, townhome design, or is that what you consider, good townhome design? Because, I look at your code 6 for the townhomes, 6 primary entrance, and where you say the primary entrance townhouse residences shall, A, be clearly visible and accessible by a walkway from the adjacent street. So then I look at 27B, And I'm thinking, okay, well, that probably couldn't be built and adhere to that, that 6A requirement. Is that, am I reading that, am I looking at that picture and reading that section of the code and coming to the right conclusion?
I apologize to the chair at that last point. You asked how could they be built to adhere to that standard? Is that your question from 27B?
Would 27B be considered as being built to that standard?
Well, the standard to be, through the chair, the standard to be clearly visible from the adjacent street, it's challenging on two fronts. One is the interpretation of clearly visible, and the second is maybe what you were alluding to is there an alternative to the street being a visible, common, open space, shared space that the doors could open onto the space. For getting to those challenges, of course, the goal behind the standard is partly public safety, it's orientation, and it's also orientation meaning wayfinding, being able to find your way to the front door, which is not always easy or apparent in the front of some of the buildings we have. And so the idea is that it's clear where the path to the front entrance is. It could be announced by a gateway or by a space, and then the entrances within the space, perhaps they're announced through some features that increase their prominence. But the clearly visible from the street, it replaced an earlier standard, an earlier draft, which was that they face the street, that they be on the facade facing the street. And townhouse developments, especially where the buildings set sideways to the street, and so the fronts of the townhouses are facing a courtyard or shared space. They can't face the street, so the fallback is to be clearly visible from the street, perhaps via a shared open space, an accessible, visible shared open space. I would say that probably a different reviewer might have a different opinion as to whether these entrances meet the standard. However, if I were standing there looking into the development and I was standing on the street or on the sidewalk, I would probably have to say that some of those entrances are clearly visible, and the roof elements above them help make them visible. Some of them may not be. A fallback could be somehow making them visible from a clearly announced main pathway or civic space, like you mentioned, a common private open space.
It seems what might be missing here in this instance is this identification of a commons and the relevance of a commons in establishing some sort of pedestrian-oriented frontage. I think that this could be a successful solution. It starts to get it to your definition of entry. Certainly the entry from the street is well demarcated, but being able to get to the individual unit entries is something that where now you've turned the commons into the street and you need to be calling out their attention from the commons. And you don't really have a section where you talk about that, where you create a pedestrian-focused arterial or whatever, and from that begs a different level of scale that the automobiles, wouldn't be operating on. So if we wanted to look at successful, and I can see where this 27B, you could have successful iterations of that type of orientation. I've seen it in many planned unit developments where they have this sort of commons area that's vehicle-free, and that could be a nice pedestrian space. so long as you've got the proper separations, so long as you've got pedestrian amenities, so long as there's some mechanism for snow removal and all of these other things. But in the standard as it's written, you really don't recognize a pedestrian commons as an entity. You talk about alleys, you talk about streets, but you don't have this kind of intermediate. And that might be an area of improvement.
Those are good points, and I think it's particularly relevant to the to the townhomes, because where you are going to have higher density, you're more likely to have people who are pedestrian or transit pedestrian mode, taking transit to and from their for their trips, and as a result, then it would seem that you'd want to have more of an emphasis in that townhome section on establishing that pedestrian realm, that common space for pedestrians, and defining this not just where it's just a blank horizontal space, but it's where it's defined through amenities, through various characteristics that are included as part of the project. I certainly think that would strengthen it and make it more workable, I think, for a pedestrian scale.
Yeah, I think that it's a whole other area of focus. I mean, clearly, if you have buildings that are separated by, what looks here to be maybe 20 or 30 feet, the height and scale standards for buildings of that separation, if you have a 3-story building that's only separated by 20 feet, it's going to create a whole different scale scenario than you would passing by at 25 or 30 miles an hour in a car. So, how you break that facade down may have a lot to do with what those separation standards are from a scale standpoint.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
So this section really deals with building design. It doesn't really deal with site design. And I think that's where the pedestrian connectivity needs to be addressed. And I don't know if that is found in the PUD standards or the subdivision standards. For example, if somebody is putting in a large development of townhouses, requiring them to connect to bring sidewalks into the development alongside the access streets would be the way to address pedestrian connectivity. And I don't think you need to deal with that here. This is all about the design and the massing of the building itself.
Well, I guess where I start to break down is this the notion of what's the front of the building. You talk about specific standards for the rear of the building and how far apart the rear of the building could be separated in the front of the building. Well, we have these situations where these are kind of the side of the building as viewed from your main public way, and that becomes the front, and your frontage requirements from a scale and aesthetic standpoint sort of change at that point because you're dealing with a different kind of scale issue than you would be at the street, and the amount of open space that you'd have for having a street. And that very much does get into, I mean, if you're talking about frontage and the percentage of frontage and the amount of, how you call out entrances, I think would have a lot to do with how fast you're traveling in that public way, that frontage. So, it just seems like a missing component right now. Commissioner Briggs.
And to speak somewhat to generalities, I understand that other sections and design areas are prescriptive or performance-based. 2020 ideals and intent provide overall guidance for this. And within these specific building standards, another generality is that there's a very wide line between performance standards and prescriptive standards, and I think that's one of the issues we've been dealing with for the landscaping aspect of Title 21 as well, is how far do you go to trying to account for every situation that you're in versus trying to provide some nice guidance to the good designers that are out there. And I think that most of the examples in here that are the ones that I assume that you're not calling out as good examples are the ones that are, to turn over a quick buck or cheap materials or, vinyl siding was on sale that day. that don't necessarily have the good designers behind it. So I understand the prescriptive aspect of this, but I think it's always going to have exceptions, and people find a way around something, or they turn the building sideways and suddenly everything goes out the door. So I guess my concern as a designer is that the performance basis within these, in the purpose, some of the larger language that could somehow be enforceable by staff or whoever is going to be looking at this is in place as well. And speaking to Commissioner Kemplin's comment on just speaking to some of the pedestrian aspects, in the purpose, and I guess I'd like to see parity between the purpose for both of these. The purpose for the townhouse ends with thereby enhancing public safety and the pedestrian realm. I think that same statement should probably in the standards for single-family and two-family residential dwellings as well. They should have parity in the overall design intent. And if you have that in there, then somewhere down the line, Sharon or someone can say, well, this doesn't help the pedestrian realm. I would like to see it have a sidewalk. And there's something to enforce that with because it's in the writing, is to provide the big fuzzy language that makes things easier for you and us. Rather than 3 windows of 15 square feet on the southern exposure. And
Mr. Kemplin.
Mr. Chairman, another point. I noticed that in the in the residential design standards, there's a section on light view and privacy. In the multifamily, I don't. Did I see that? Is that residential design standards for townhomes? Okay, so you have light view and privacy in the townhomes. Sorry, but the light view and privacy is not really kind of geared towards solar, orientation. And we have heard, from our medical professionals that seasonal affective disorder, is real here in our subarctic environment. That it affects a significant number of the population, and it results in reduced, productivity, in the workplace, and it does lead to depression and the like. And so in seeing, not seeing some mention of solar orientation, for these structures, so that at least it would seem that you'd want to have some part of that of a building to have some sun. So that you minimize the impact that the darkness has on our population. And right now there's really nothing to that speaks to the importance of solar access. Is there a reason why there's no discussion of solar access, or a certain percentage of maybe the main living area be exposed to a certain amount of light at a certain period of the year? Has there been some opposition to providing solar access to these residential developments?
Through the chair, you are correct. The townhouse section does now, as proposed in the track changes draft, address building spacing, minimum building spacing. So that 27B might not occur, for example, where the buildings are so close. However, and that change was made during a review in which we caught, the multifamily section is dealing with building spacing. Townhouse section is not. One of the reasons that was not caught earlier was that we had been testing several developments that didn't really shout out that they were would actually be townhouses. But if you could turn to 30A and 30B, This is a pair of fourplexes in Fairview on 9th and Medfra. For a time, we were testing those under the multifamily standards, and actually I think that's about 20 feet between the two buildings. They're built side by side, and the multifamily development standards in subsection G has a menu, subsection 10 on page 106, 107, which deals with weather protection and sunlight, and there's some menu options that deal with sunlight access, and some of them get quite technical regarding amount of sunlight access, when they get sunlight access, what angle, this and that is intended for the multifamily section to, in addition to the basic building space requirement and the basic daylighting, each facade in that multifamily building have 10% of that facade being windows, that this sunlight, weather protection and sunlight choices menu would encourage some further thought with regard to solar orientation while providing enough flexibility to deal with different situations. One of the reasons why the townhouse section was relatively undeveloped is because for a long time we had a sense that the townhouse, we knew what a townhouse dwelling was. It was, often what's occurring in, the very front of your document in 2A and these site condominium developments where they're side by side and they're spaced apart and maybe they're smaller scale than multifamily. And what we've gradually begun to realize is that things like 30A, 30B in your photographs aren't actually going to be subject to the multifamily design standards. They're going to be subject to the townhouse standards. And that occurred to a lot of folks, including me, a little late in the process. In fact, these would be called a townhouse-style construction under the Title 21 rewrite. So that's basically how that happened, that difference. Multifamily is going to get higher, bigger in scale than this. But if that were a fourplex, and those were flats, and they were stacked in that building in 30A, they would have to comply with the weather protection sunlight menu. But they're side by side. They're four two-story units in a row. It's a townhouse. Doesn't have to comply with the menu. And that was a challenge. We've attempted to address at least some of that through the addition of a spacing requirement in the track changes draft. That's how that occurred.
So these, you see a lot of these, fourplexes on 7,000 square foot lots, in Mountain View and in Fairview, sort of the old, parts of town, those old lot sizes. And so these would be, if there's a vacant lot or a single family, older single family that gets torn down and a higher density structure gets put up, it'll be subject to the townhome section of the revised Title 21. Is that what you're saying?
Through the chair, if it's a typical fourplex in which the units are stacked, it would comply with the multifamily requirements. But if it's townhouse style, which is basically what these are, it would comply with the townhouse requirements. But if it's just a one building on a lot, these spacing requirements don't apply. Basically, all that applies are the general setback requirements of the district, the setback and height requirements. The spacing requirements, they apply when you have a multi-building development. And like in 30B or 30A and 30B. I believe, though, that in the multifamily section, I don't want to be too confusing, is where you, on pages 106, 107, I believe that would apply regardless of how many buildings you have. If you have one building, you still need to comply with that.
So, but the townhomes
standards, or definitions for townhouse?
Yeah.
Should that be in each section?
The,
Townhouse, multifamily, duplex, and fourplex, defining specifically what these things are.
yes, that's a great suggestion. We intend to provide a definition for what we're calling a townhouse-style construction. We already have defined the townhouse dwelling as a use type. That's basically a dwelling on its own lot. It's on its own parcel. Each dwelling is on its own parcel, but they're attached to, two or more other dwellings in a row. So you have rows of parcels. So, like there's some examples in town from a few years back, like Brittany Place or other developments like that, where each unit's on its own parcel. It's in a row of like 8 dwellings. That's called a townhouse dwelling use type, and you go to the permitted uses section of the code in Chapter 5, and you say, okay, townhouses are allowed in, this XYZ district through a site plan review. That's townhouses. Multiple family dwelling use is another use type. It's permitted in multifamily districts, and it's basically multiple dwellings on a lot. So if something's multifamily use, it's multiple dwellings on one lot, more than 3 dwellings on a lot. A site condominium, for example, it could be comprised of 2 duplexes, attached single family, it could be comprised of single family, could be comprised of townhouse buildings. There are multiple dwellings on a lot. So the Title 20 rewrite calls it multifamily. But the challenge is, for the design standards, some of those buildings in that multifamily use are actually single-family dwellings, they're townhouses. So we recognize that we have to come forward with a clear definition of townhouse-style construction, single-family style construction. And basically the definitions for those will be the same as the use definition for a single-family dwelling use or townhouse dwelling use, but what will be different is that the use type is based on the dwelling is on its own lot. It's a single-family house on its own lot, it's a single-family dwelling. But the townhouse style construction will be one dwelling attached to more than, with its own front entrance, rear entrance, it's ground oriented, it's not stacked, it's attached to 2 or more other dwellings in a row, building. That's townhouse style construction. Basically, townhouse building. But the challenge with the way the code's working is that the use type is still multifamily when there's 2 levels. There's a use.
Building use type, as in the building code, is that what you're referring to?
It's within Title 21. Title 21 has the permitted uses section. So you have the permitted use level, and then what we're looking at here is more the form-based level. Like the form-based codes they're not only looking at use types anymore. Now they're looking at, okay, you can have your barber shop, but the building type may be, you have different building types. You have a carriage house. They have different building types, and they start regulating the building types. So that's kind of what's happening here without saying it is almost like a form-based approach where you're working on 2 levels. And so if the building type is townhouse, regardless of whatever you're calling the use, whether it's multifamily or townhouse, you have a townhouse building type, the townhouse standards apply. And that's what happened in this 30B. It's a multifamily use because there are multiple dwellings on that lot, but the building form style being addressed in the design standards is townhouse.
So maybe you need different terms that don't conflict with the land use. Don't call it a townhouse, call it something else that doesn't get confused with the...
So I always thought townhouse was a 2-story unit attached. Okay, it could be a condominium, meaning it's owned as a single-family unit, or it could be an apartment that somebody is renting. But I always thought the townhouse was a two-story attached dwelling unit, whether it's just two or, 20 in a row.
There's a party wall that's 2 stories high. But
Well,
we get
definitions,
into
I
semantics
know.
about whether that party wall is on a property line or not. And it seems like we need to, like you say, they get into this form-based mode where it's based on the appearance, not based on where the property lines are or whether it's 1-story or 2-story, or and talk about the form models so that they don't get confused with all of these other definitions.
Well, as we all know, definitions are critical in zoning.
Commissioner Joyner, you had something?
Yeah, thank you. Well, partly that was it. The more you talked, the more questions I had, but maybe Mr. Dougherty clarified it. It's too confusing to have townhouses and townhouse-type non-townhouses and multifamily-like dwellings. So on these, I understand the ones that say that these wouldn't meet the code and the ones that would meet the code. What about the one that's just photo booklet and townhouse? Are they just pictures and they don't have they're just pictures with no particular?
Through the chair, Commissioner Joyner, the one that says photo booklet for the Planning and Zoning Commission was one that I had put together for the work session that we did last week, and unfortunately, only a couple of UDC members were able to attend, but I as I walked through the single and two-family section, I was referring to different photos in this booklet.
Some are good and some are bad.
Exactly. And some are particular examples of what a section is about. So, yeah.
And then you said the P&Z on Monday changed some of had recommendations that watered some down. Would they have moved anything that was in the meet the code packet into the doesn't meet the code, or the other way around?
One of the things that they requested that we do is separate the single family from the two family. And the changes that they recommended on Monday they really only got through the single family section and they didn't start. They said, pretend there are two sections, we're going to talk about this as single family, and they didn't really get to two family. What they recommended, let's see if I can find the right photos, is in a situation where the garage, one of the biggest changes was in a situation where the garage door is flush with the rest of the facade or recessed behind the main facade, you would only have to meet 2 of the 10 choices in the garage section. But if your garage stuck out towards the street, like in picture 7 of the photo booklet, if it stuck out towards the street some, then they recommended only meeting 4 of the 10 standards. And this is all if your garage is between 50 and 65% of the width of your facade. Our recommendation had been, no matter what, you meet 5 of the 10. So they reduced, the recommendation was to reduce that significantly. The other significant recommendation was some changes to 3B2I, basically what created a different housing model, how you would judge whether you have different housing models. So those were their main adjustments. And again, just addressing single family, and at their next, not their next meeting, but their next time with us, which is in about a month, they'll be taking up the two-family issue.
Okay. Then on the requirement that you be able to see into the street for safety, which is a good one, because I actually live in a townhouse where I can't see in my own driveway without going outside, and there are times you want to know what's going on in your driveway or your neighbors without actually being out in your driveway. So I noticed in here the things that are meet the standards now, in the house in, you couldn't see in your driveway from that house either, or your neighbor's driveway, without opening the garage door or walking out into the driveway is the only way you can see in the driveway.
And I'm sorry, did you say that's a standard?
This is in these meet the standards now, it says.
But I don't think we have a standard that says you have to be able to see in your driveway.
No, I was just pointing out that if you're trying to meet
That
a
would be
safety
good.
thing, that's the safety thing that,
I see, thank you.
not that you can just see like a block away and other people's into the street, but,
I
and
understand.
maybe some houses you can't make it that way, but there's a good reason to be able to see what's going on at your neighbors and in front of your own house. And when all the windows and doors are set back like that, you don't really have any way of knowing what's going on in your own front yard without walking out there in your pajamas or whatever.
Might be a moose asleep out there.
And then I just noticed looking at these things that aren't permitted, that many, if not the majority, have been built since we've been going through the process of deciding what's going to be acceptable. And I expect many of them were built by people who were concerned that we're making the requirements too high, and I think it's too bad that we've built so many things that people knew were not going to be acceptable pretty quickly all over town. Not like a few places, but like thousands of units of things that have been built in the last few years while we went through this very, very long process that, as Mr. Kemplin pointed out, may not be drastically different from what we had before. And so I hope, as Commissioner Ania said, I hope there's some process for when changes are made, or when, unfortunately, some of these are going to burn down in large numbers because they didn't leave any access for fire trucks, that they can't put the same thing back again. That when changes get made, we're not stuck with these. I mean, a lot of these, they're not built to last 100 years, so as they start falling apart pretty soon, that when something else comes in, they can't put back the same kind of construction that's on the site now.
Commissioner Joyner, as I mentioned in the nonconformities chapter, which is chapter 12, they did exempt single-family and two-family homes from being nonconforming for most situations. And I think there was concern about when you have, say, a site condo development where you have, 10 houses or all the houses look pretty much exactly the same, and one burns down, that the desire of the homeowner would be to fit back into that neighborhood. And so they didn't want that person to be forced to build something that looked completely different from everything around them.
Possibly all of them burned down. Or,
Well,
I mean, at some point,
if they all burned down, that's a different
they would
situation.
redo a whole row of them. At some
Yeah.
point, and I don't think it's going to be that far in the future, considering we only redo Title 21 every 30 years, that some of these are going to have major remodels or redos. And because it isn't just the looks. A lot of these are really impacted neighborhoods because there's no place to park. And so all these people that are in these 30 houses with no parking are parked on the sidewalks of other people's neighborhoods and in fire access and all kind of things. So they really are impacting a bigger area than just their little square.
Commissioner Briggs, was that a look of?
I think it's just an interesting comment on Commissioner Joyner's comment, is that I think it's actually a benefit if you have a neighborhood of 10 similar houses, and if you put in a new house, that's the way neighborhoods grow and develop. A lot of the post-World War II suburban tract developments that now actually look like nice areas have been because they've been torn down, had infill, or the buildings have been renovated and developed over time to be different from each other. So for us, for these houses that have a 10-year lifespan, if one gets replaced every 5 years, you will have a more interesting neighborhood, perhaps.
That's true, I think, particularly where you do have a subdivision. I'm not sure of our ability to, what happens in a site condo with the condo association and those sorts of rules. But I think that's a good point.
Everybody had a chance to speak? Commissioner Gasson.
No, I just have to talk on that topic just a little bit because, of course, with me and my bent on historic preservation, I have to pipe in. But in some cases, continuity of design, I think, is really rewarding for a pedestrian experience on the street, too, to have continuation of sight lines and for people to have that, like, sense of place when they walk into a neighborhood. So I think it's kind of nice to have the option to actually rebuild in a similar manner in some cases, too. Yes. Or at least the appropriate scale, like maybe not exact design, but to work with scale a little bit. Because if you're working in a neighborhood that has many one, or maybe a neighborhood that has two-story buildings, you don't want to have pop-ups to three sometimes, because that's going to ruin the sight line that's already been established for years.
Mr. Joyner?
Well, that makes me think of South Addition, which is one of our few nice established kind of neighborhoods with sidewalks and streets, and that's happening where the low houses that look like they fit are going away, and they're getting replaced by things that are lot line to lot line that don't fit in. And I don't know if you're addressing that, but that's a good example of that happening where it's not good.
I guess, my biggest concern in reading these standards, the first one had to do with renovations. And, if you have a neighborhood full of snout homes, there's really no way to bring that into compliance as these are written. It almost seems like you need another standard for renovations, and I'm not sure how you'd handle that. And certainly it's relevant, tonight, just in talking about Chester Valley and Sand Lake, where you're not able to always bring everything into compliance. With these kind of prescriptive standards where you have this scorecard where you have to do 3 or 5 or 6 things, it just might not be achievable, but it's something that we want to move towards, kind of using your baby steps analogy. We don't want to prohibit it because it's so far out of sync, but maybe there are things that can be done that would make the neighborhood more interesting as it evolves. But you'd almost have to handle it in a separate section on renovation with standards about what triggers, the need to comply. So that was one. And then the other, I think Tom addressed a little bit earlier, but we just wanted to feel better about it, is this idea of alternative roads to compliance. Some of the greatest icons of the 20th century would not pass these standards, and I certainly wouldn't want to prohibit that sort of future innovation or whatnot that may meet all of the intent, but wouldn't meet the prescriptive standards. So it's my understanding that that would not be left up to staff, that the procedure that would be in place would be to put those type of alternative compliance requests before a board like ours.
Not necessarily. The way the alternative compliance section is proposed right now is that whoever the decision-making body would be kind of normally, that would be the decision-making body for alternative equivalent compliance. So for many traditional townhouse developments, when we're talking subdivided townhouses, it requires an administrative site plan review. The decision-making body for an administrative site plan review is the director. So the director would be the decision-making body for the alternative compliance. For, say, a PUD, well, that's not a good example because they have a lot of flexibility anyway, but some other situation that required a major site plan review, which is a public hearing before this body, if someone were to propose an alternative equivalent design under that process, it would still be a public hearing before this body. So that was the intent behind the way it's written. I will note that appeals from the director's decision on administrative site plan review do basically turn into a major site plan review and come to this body with a public hearing.
Any other questions for staff? All right. Do you need anything other than the minutes to this meeting in terms of guidance? Do you need motions or anything like that?
I think it's really up to you. If you desire to create a formal resolution or something, we'd be happy to draft that for you. If you're satisfied with the discussion we've had this evening, the comments you've provided with us, we've both been taking notes, and that's fine, too.
Well, I'll give 10 seconds for a motion, otherwise we'll figure that what our discussion was will just stand as guidance.
Now, I heard staff say that they'd be willing to draft up a resolution based upon some of the discussion that occurred here, in particular regarding the emphasis on the the automobile relative to the pedestrian on the facades of these structures. Is that something that?
Is that correct? You take the record of this meeting and then try to hit the highlights and create a resolution that would come back before us?
I can do that, yes.
Like, didn't we get one before, like when we did the landscape discussion, it came back and we looked at it and said, yeah, that seemed to work well.
But I just want to point out there was a difference there between what we did what you all did at the landscaping meeting. That was really just a letter of recommendation. It wasn't a formal resolution.
I don't see there really being a necessity for a resolution, other than maybe a recommendation that they do make sure this is in parity with larger planning documents, speaking to the pedestrian aspects of what we want to do locally, speaking to the larger pictures rather than a resolution. I don't know if I would be comfortable if we were doing a resolution on this.
Well, if not a resolution, some sort of statement, from the body, whether it's a letter, whether it's a more informal, communication, but just something that provides, a little bit greater clarity as to, the points that of concern.
I guess I would agree. We've had over an hour, hour and a half more of discussion on this. It'd be nice to move forward to the Assembly and other bodies with some clarity in terms of what was gained from talking to the UDC. And, there's been 4, 5, 6 points that have been brought up that might be nice to summarize, and then have us have the opportunity to concur that these were the high points, and give us a chance to maybe make another edit if we think, you never really addressed this idea of commons or scale on the side elevation, or the importance of the automobile and some of these other things like that. But if you could summarize what the key points are that you gained from taking up the time in this work session, I think that would be beneficial.
I will do that.
That'd be productive, I think.
Okay. Anything else? Anything else on any other subject that we have to cover tonight?
Motion to adjourn.
Any objection? I guess we're adjourned.